The Price of Secrets, Chapter 1. The House on Willow Lane. The Anderson family home stood at the end of Willow Lane, a wide two-story craftsman house with a blue porch swing and white shutters that always needed painting. For as long as anyone in the small town of Millersville could remember, the Andersons had lived there, raising their children, celebrating holidays, and weathering storms both literal and metaphorical. It was a place of comfort and tradition, but as the summer sun filtered through the willow trees, the house also felt heavy with memories, some cherished, some best left untouched. Helen Anderson, the matriarch, woke before dawn each day, moving through the house with quiet purpose. She brewed coffee, fed the cat, and set the kitchen table for breakfast with a military precision that came from decades of keeping the family's chaos at bay. Her husband, Tom, a retired high school principal, sat at the kitchen counter reading the local newspaper, his thick hands wrapped around a chipped mug. Their 3 children, David, the oldest and a promising attorney, Julia, the middle child with a restless spirit, and Emily, the youngest, still in high school, were all home that summer. It was a rare alignment prompted by Tom's recent heart attack and the gravity that seemed to pull them back to Willow Lane whenever the family was in crisis. On the outside, the Andersons looked like a picture-perfect American family. Helen and Tom celebrated 32 years of marriage. David's framed diplomas and Julia's soccer trophies lined the hallway. Emily's laughter, bright and infectious, echoed through the rooms. But beneath the polished surface, cracks were beginning to show. David had returned from New York under the guise of taking time off, but Helen sensed the truth. Something was wrong. Julia bounced from job to job, unable to settle anywhere for long, chasing adventures that never seemed to fill the emptiness she carried. Emily, always the peacemaker, tried to keep the family together, her own fears about Tom's health buried under smiles and jokes. That morning, as Helen poured coffee for Tom, the phone rang, its shrill tone slicing through the quiet. Helen glanced at the caller ID, her heart sinking. It was Tom's brother, Richard, calling from Florida. She hesitated, then answered. "Richard, is everything okay?" There was a long pause. "Helen, I need to talk to Tom, now." Helen handed the phone over, concern furrowing her brow as Tom's expression changed from confusion to worry. He listened, silent, then uttered a clipped, "I'll see what I can do," before hanging up. "What's wrong?" Helen pressed. Tom shook his head, rubbing his temple. "Richard, he's in trouble. Money. He needs our help." Helen sighed. Richard had always been the black sheep, charming but unreliable, a magnet for bad luck and worse decisions. Every few years he reappeared with a new crisis, and Tom, out of loyalty or guilt, always tried to bail him out. Julia wandered in, still in pajamas, hair tousled. "Who was that?" "Uncle Richard," Tom replied. "He's got himself into a mess again." Julia rolled her eyes. "Of course he has." The family's morning routine unraveled. David joined them, dressed in yesterday's suit, face drawn and pale. He poured himself coffee, avoiding everyone's eyes. Helen studied her children. David seemed thinner, exhausted in a way that no amount of sleep could fix. Julia's sarcasm was sharper than usual. Even Emily, usually a ball of energy, moved quietly, eyes darting to her father. As breakfast wore on, Tom explained the situation. Richard had borrowed money from dangerous people. He needed a place to lay low, and Tom, as always, felt responsible. Helen wanted to say no. The family had enough to deal with: Tom's health, David's silence, Julia's aimlessness. But Tom's sense of duty was immovable. That night, Richard arrived, suitcase in hand, bringing with him the scent of cheap cologne and secrets. Richard's presence changed the house. He joked too loudly, flirted with Helen's friends at church, and left his things everywhere. The Andersons tried to maintain normalcy, but tension simmered. Helen noticed money missing from her purse. David's phone calls became more secretive. Julia argued with Richard late at night, voices carrying through the thin walls. Emily, ever the observer, watched it all unfold. She saw how Richard's arrival drew out the worst in everyone. Old grudges, new lies, resentment that festered in the heat of summer. The Andersons' carefully constructed world began to tilt, secrets bubbling to the surface. One night, Helen found Richard rifling through Tom's desk drawers. She confronted him, her voice low but fierce. Richard laughed it off, but Helen's instincts screamed danger. The next morning, she warned Tom, "Your brother is going to bring us nothing but trouble." But Tom only sighed, the weight of family loyalty pressing on his shoulders. "He's my brother, Helen. I can't turn him away." As the summer deepened, the Andersons would discover just how high the price of secrets could be, and that even the strongest families have breaking points. Chapter 2. Tension Under the Surface. Summer in Millersville always carried a peculiar sense of stillness. The air shimmered above the asphalt, and the willow trees lining Willow Lane drooped their branches as if weighed down by secrets. Inside the Anderson house, however, that stillness was deceptive. A thin skin stretched tight over swelling unrest. Richard's arrival disrupted the fragile balance that Helen had fought so hard to maintain. He moved through the house with the reckless energy of someone who believed that rules were for other people. He snuck cigarettes out on the back porch, left dirty dishes in the sink, and borrowed Tom's car without asking. He flirted openly with Julia's friends and left crumpled bills, sometimes more than he should have, in Emily's tip jar from her weekend job at the bakery. Tom, despite Helen's misgivings, seemed almost relieved to have his brother around. He spent evenings talking with Richard on the porch, laughing over old stories from their childhood, nursing beers late into the night. The children watched their father come alive again, seeing flashes of the man he'd been before the heart attack, before retirement began to wear on his nerves. But as the weeks went on, it became clear that Richard's problems were far from simple. He took secretive phone calls in the garage, speaking in low, urgent tones. Helen caught him rifling through old bills, their personal documents. Once, Julia overheard a tense conversation that ended with Richard swearing under his breath and slamming the door. Julia, for her part, was the first to confront him. She cornered him in the kitchen after dinner one night, the smell of garlic and lemon still hanging in the air. "What exactly are you doing here, Richard?" she demanded, arms crossed. Richard flashed a careless grin. "Family vacation, kiddo." Julia narrowed her eyes. "Is that why you've been on the phone with people who call you at 2 a.m? He shrugged. "Just tying up loose ends." But Julia wasn't convinced. Her patience, never her strongest virtue, was wearing thin. Later, she found Emily in her room, headphones on, furiously scribbling in her sketchbook. Emily, usually quick to confide in her older siblings, was withdrawn, her answers clipped and tense. "Hey," Julia said softly, sitting beside her on the bed. "Everything okay?" Emily hesitated, then nodded, but her eyes darted to the door. "He freaks me out sometimes. I caught him going through my backpack." Julia's protective instincts flared. "Did you tell Mom?" Emily shook her head. "She's stressed enough. I want things to go back to normal." Normal. The word tasted bitter to Julia. How long had it been since anything felt normal? Downstairs, Helen moved through her routines with growing anxiety. She checked the locks twice before bed, started hiding her jewelry and cash in new places, and found herself jumping at every unexpected sound. Tom brushed off her worries. "He's family, Helen. He just needs a little time." But Helen remembered too well the last time Richard had needed just a little time. That episode had ended with police at the door and Tom covering a 4-figure loan. Richard's presence also magnified the other fault lines in the family. David's troubles, which had been easy to ignore in the bustle of daily life, grew impossible to overlook. He spent hours pacing the backyard, phone pressed to his ear, voice tense and hushed. Helen once overheard him arguing with someone about partnerships and deadlines. At dinner, he picked at his food, answering questions with monosyllables. Helen tried to reach him. One evening, as the sky faded from pink to indigo, She found David on the porch steps, shoulders slumped. "David, honey, are you all right?" He didn't look at her. "Yeah, just tired." She sat beside him, waiting, as she'd done since he was a little boy and needed coaxing to tell her about playground fights or broken hearts. "Is it work?" she asked quietly. David was silent for a long time. "You could say that. Things didn't go how I planned." Helen put her arm around him. "You don't have to carry everything by yourself." David only shook his head. She heard the tremor in his voice when he finally whispered, "What if I can't fix this, Mom?" Helen hugged him tighter. "Whatever it is, we'll get through it. Together." Inside, Tom and Richard's laughter drifted through the open window. For a fleeting moment, Helen envied their ability to forget, to lose themselves in nostalgia. But reality was never far behind. One night, the fragile peace shattered. The family was awakened by pounding on the front door. Tom opened it to find two men in dark jackets, strangers, their faces hard and unreadable. They asked for Richard. Tom's hands shook as he called for his brother. Richard appeared, his face pale, jaw set. A heated argument ensued on the porch, voices rising, curses flung into the night. Helen gathered the children behind her, her heart pounding. The men left as suddenly as they'd arrived, tires squealing on the driveway. Richard came back inside, breathing hard. Tom demanded an explanation, but Richard deflected, claiming it was a misunderstanding, insisting that everything was fine. Helen didn't believe him. The next morning, she confronted Tom. "We need to send him away, Tom. This is our home, our children." Tom's face was gray with fatigue. "I can't turn my back on him, Helen. Not now." "But what about us?" Helen's voice broke. "What about our family?" The days blurred into each other. Helen felt the house closing in, every creak and shadow a warning. Julia started spending nights at a friend's house. David grew more withdrawn. Emily stopped bringing friends home. It all came to a head one sweltering afternoon when Richard disappeared. His suitcase was gone. Tom, frantic, called every contact he could think of. Helen feared the worst, that the trouble Richard brought with him had finally come to collect. The Andersons waited in tense silence for hours until, at sunset, Richard returned, bruised, shaken, and empty-handed. He offered no explanation, only a desperate plea. "Please let me stay. I have nowhere else to go." Helen, looking into his haunted eyes, saw not just her brother-in-law, but a man broken by his own choices. She didn't know how to help him, or if it was even possible. But as darkness settled over Willow Lane, Helen understood one thing with cold clarity. Secrets could only be hidden for so long. Sooner or later, they would tear even the closest family apart. Chapter 3. Cracks in the Foundation. The weeks following Richard's return marked a subtle but unmistakable shift in the Anderson home. It was as if the very walls, saturated with decades of laughter and tradition, now pulsed with a silent dread. Every conversation seemed to carry a subtext. Every gesture was loaded with meaning. Summer's heat grew oppressive, and the tension that had simmered just beneath the surface now began to boil over. Richard kept mostly to himself after his mysterious disappearance and return, but his presence was inescapable. Helen would sometimes catch him staring blankly out the window or pacing restlessly at night, his phone gripped tight in his hand. Once she found him asleep at the kitchen table, head resting on crossed arms, an open bottle of whiskey beside him. The man who had once filled the house with raucous laughter and inappropriate jokes now seemed haunted by ghosts only he could see. Tom became even more withdrawn, guilt gnawing at him. He oscillated between anger at his brother and a desperate need to protect him, as if saving Richard could somehow redeem decades of old family wounds. He was short-tempered with Helen and the children, snapping at the smallest things, a spilled drink, a misplaced shoe. At night, Helen would hear him moving through the house, checking windows and doors, muttering to himself about keeping everyone safe. The children retreated into their own worlds. David spent more time out of the house than in it. He drove aimlessly through the town, sometimes parking his car in a grocery store lot and staring into the darkness for hours. Julia started coming home later and later, her hair smelling of cigarette smoke, her eyes guarded and sharp. Emily, once the sunniest presence in the home, moved quietly from room to room, careful not to attract attention. She kept her sketchbooks hidden under her mattress, her drawings growing darker by the day. One Saturday morning, Helen found Emily sitting alone in the backyard, knees drawn up to her chest, staring at the ground. "Sweetheart, what's wrong?" Helen asked, kneeling beside her. Emily hesitated. "Do you think Uncle Richard's going to leave?" Helen paused. She wanted to offer reassurance, to promise her daughter that everything would be all right, but she found herself unable to lie. "I don't know," she said honestly, "but whatever happens, we'll face it together." Emily nodded but didn't look convinced. Inside, Julia eavesdropped on the conversation, heart pounding. The helplessness in her mother's voice frightened her more than anything Richard had ever done. Later that day, as Tom was mowing the lawn, Richard approached him, looking hollow-eyed and desperate. "I can't stay here, Tommy," he said quietly. "It's not safe for any of you. They're not going to stop looking." Tom stopped the mower, breathing heavily. "Who?" "Richard. What did you do?" Richard glanced toward the house, voice low. "I got mixed up with the wrong people. Borrowed money I couldn't pay back. I thought I could fix it, but it's too late now." Tom's face fell. "You should have told me." Richard shook his head. "Wouldn't have made a difference." The conversation ended there, but the words lingered in Tom's mind, heavy as lead. That night, a storm rolled over Millersville, lightning illuminating the shadows that pressed in on the Anderson home. The family ate dinner in near silence, forks scraping against plates the only sound. Helen watched each of her children, her husband, and even Richard, feeling the distance between them stretch and grow. After dinner, David finally spoke, voice strained. "I need to talk to you, Dad. Alone." Tom followed him onto the porch, rain hammering the roof above. "Dad, I'm in trouble," David admitted, voice barely audible over the storm. "Work trouble. Legal trouble." Tom looked weary. "What happened?" David hesitated, then poured out the story. How a client had asked him to bend the rules, how he'd done it to save his job, how it had all spiraled out of control. Now he was being investigated, and the stress was eating him alive. Tom put a hand on his son's shoulder. "We'll figure it out. We always do." But David didn't look convinced. Inside, Helen comforted Emily, who was frightened by the thunder. Julia stood by the window, watching the lightning flash, wondering when, if ever, things would return to normal. In the middle of the night, the phone rang. Helen answered, heart pounding. A gruff voice on the other end spoke. "Tell Richard his time is up." The line went dead. Helen stood in the darkness, the receiver trembling in her hand. She felt the weight of all the family's secrets pressing down on her, threatening to crush her. She woke Tom, and together they confronted Richard. He confessed. His debts were larger than he'd admitted, and the people after him were dangerous. Staying put was no longer safe. Helen made a decision. "You have to go, Richard, for all our sakes." Richard's eyes filled with tears, but he nodded. "I'm sorry. For everything." By dawn, he was gone. The next day, the Anderson house felt emptier, but also lighter. The storm had passed, but the damage lingered. Each family member was left to pick up the pieces of their lives, their trust, their hopes for the future. But as Helen watched the sun rise over Willow Lane, she wondered if, perhaps, this was the moment they could finally begin to heal. Chapter 4. Fractures and Fault Lines. The departure of Richard left a strange void in the Anderson home. For days, an uneasy quiet settled over the rooms, as if the entire house was holding its breath, waiting for a storm that might never come. Each family member was haunted in their own way, not just by Richard's secrets, but by the fragments of their own private fears and regrets. Helen, for perhaps the first time in decades, allowed herself to truly rest. She slept through the night for the first time in months, but her dreams were restless, a patchwork of memories. Richard as a mischievous young man, Tom in his teaching days, the children when they were small and easily comforted. She woke each morning with a sense of melancholy and relief, realizing she had been holding the family together by sheer willpower for far too long. Yet peace did not last. With Richard gone, the problems that had simmered quietly beneath the surface began to rise. David's legal troubles grew more pressing. The mailbox began to fill with ominous-looking letters, subpoenas, official notices, warnings from the State Bar Association. David grew gaunt, circles forming under his eyes, his hands trembling as he tried to explain to Tom what might happen if the investigation turned against him. Tom struggled to balance compassion and discipline. He wanted to help his son, but was angry at the choices David had made. Sometimes, in moments of frustration, Tom's voice rose, echoing through the house. David shrank from the confrontation, but Helen knew her husband's anger was rooted in fear. Fear that he was losing the control he'd always prided himself on. Fear that his family would be defined by failure rather than resilience. Julia's absences grew longer. She began staying with a friend across town, returning home only for clean clothes or to sleep a few hours before vanishing again. Helen worried, but Julia refused to discuss what she was running from or toward. At dinner, Julia's seat was often empty, her absence a silent accusation. Emily retreated deeper into herself. She began skipping meals, locking herself in her room for hours, filling sketchbook after sketchbook with shadowy drawings, jagged shapes, stormy skies, people with no faces. Once Helen found a drawing of their house, but the windows were black and the sky above it full of lightning. The image sent a chill through her. She tried to talk to Emily, but the girl only shrugged, retreating further. One day, while folding laundry, Helen found a crumpled note in Julia's jeans pocket. "I can't do this anymore. I'm not enough. I just want it to stop." Helen's hands trembled as she read it. She sat on the edge of Julia's bed, the note clenched in her fist, and wept. For her daughter, for her family, for all the ways love had failed to shield them. That evening, Helen confronted Julia as she tried to slip out the door. "Where are you going?" Helen demanded, blocking the exit. Julia's jaw clenched. "Out! Out where? With whom? You barely come home, Julia. You're not a child anymore, but you're still part of this family." Julia looked away. "You don't understand." Helen's voice broke. "Help me understand, please. I found your note." Julia went rigid. For a long moment, the hallway was silent but for their breathing. Then, finally, Julia spoke, her voice low. "I feel like I'm disappearing, Mom, like none of this matters. I thought if I left, if I stayed away, maybe the pain would go away. But it doesn't." Helen moved to hug her, but Julia resisted at first. Then slowly she relented, letting her mother hold her as she cried, deep, silent sobs that shook her whole frame. "I'm sorry," Julia whispered. "I just don't know how to fix it." Helen stroked her hair, remembering the little girl Julia had once been, so fierce and bright. "You don't have to fix it alone. We're still a family, even when we're lost." That night marked a tentative truce. Julia agreed to come home more often to try counseling. Helen breathed a little easier, but the sense of fragility remained. Meanwhile, Tom struggled to hold the rest of the family together. He spent hours on the phone with lawyers, researching David's case, making appointments, sending letters. But the stress wore at him. He snapped at Helen over trivial matters, withdrew into silence, and once, when a letter arrived from the State Bar Association, Helen found him in his study with his head in his hands, shaking. "Are we bad parents?" he asked her, his voice barely a whisper. Helen sat beside him, taking his hand. We're just parents. And sometimes things fall apart, no matter how hard we try to hold them together." The next morning, David received a summons to appear before a disciplinary board. The hearing was set for 2 weeks' time. The news sent fresh waves of anxiety through the household. Emily sensed the tension, even if the adults tried to shield her. She began having nightmares, waking up in the middle of the night sobbing. Helen sat with her, stroking her hair, whispering that she was safe, but she wasn't sure she believed it herself. One afternoon, a car pulled into the driveway, an unfamiliar sedan with tinted windows. Helen's heart leaped into her throat. A man in a dark suit stepped out, briefcase in hand. He introduced himself as Mr. Whitaker, the attorney assigned to David's case. He spoke in careful, measured tones, explaining what would happen at the hearing, what evidence the board had, what David needed to do to prepare. The conversation was businesslike, but Helen could see the strain in David's face, the panic simmering beneath his calm exterior. After Mr. Whitaker left, Tom tried to reassure David, but the words felt empty. David withdrew further, spending hours locked in his room, reading legal briefs and writing notes, barely eating or sleeping. That evening, Julia made dinner for the first time in weeks, a simple meal of pasta and salad. She called everyone to the table. For a moment, the family sat together, sharing food and conversation, and Helen felt a flicker of hope. But the moment was fleeting. David left the table early. Tom and Helen sat in silence, while Emily cleared the dishes. Julia disappeared into her room. Helen wandered into the backyard, the twilight heavy with the scent of honeysuckle. She looked up at the sky, searching for answers. The world felt vast and indifferent, the weight of her family's pain pressing down on her. She realized then that the fractures in their foundation were not just caused by Richard's chaos, but by years of unspoken hurt, impossible expectations, and the simple, devastating truth that love alone could not always save them. But she also knew this. As long as they kept trying, kept reaching for each other in the darkness, there was still a chance, however fragile, to rebuild. Chapter 5. The Breaking Point. The last days of August brought a sticky, oppressive heat to Millersville, a suffocating blanket that seemed to press down not just on the air, but on the Anderson family itself. School supplies lined the stores, and the calendar on the kitchen wall signaled the end of another summer. Yet for the Andersons, time had begun to feel less like a cycle of renewal and more like a trap, one they couldn't seem to escape. Helen felt it most acutely in the small moments, in the silence that greeted her every morning, in the weight of the empty house when the kids were gone, in Tom's vacant gaze at the breakfast table. It was as if the Anderson home had become haunted by its own memories, by the ghosts of what the family once was, and the shadows of what it might become. David, burdened by the coming hearing, withdrew into himself almost entirely. He spent his days in a blur of legal research, drafting and redrafting statements, making endless lists that never seemed to bring him any closer to a solution. His room was littered with crumpled notes and empty coffee mugs. He hardly ate. Occasionally, Helen would catch him sitting on his bed, head in his hands, staring at nothing. She wanted to help but didn't know how. Her words felt thin, powerless in the face of his despair. Tom, usually the bedrock of the family, began to fracture under the pressure. He grew irritable, quick to anger, but also strangely absent, as if he were only half present in his own life. Sometimes Helen would find him wandering the backyard late at night, talking softly to himself, his silhouette lonely against the moonlight. Julia tried to return to her old self, coming home more often, even trying to help with Emily's homework or making small talk at dinner. But beneath her efforts was a restlessness she couldn't shake, a constant need to be anywhere but here, to outrun the sense that she was failing herself and everyone else. Emily, meanwhile, shrank further away from her family. Her grades began to slip, her laughter vanished. She spent long hours at the town library after school, sitting in the farthest corner, headphones in, sketching aimlessly. One afternoon, Helen received a call from the school counselor. Emily had skipped class again and had been seen wandering near the old bridge at the edge of town. Panic shot through Helen. She drove to the bridge, heart racing, and found Emily sitting on the railing, staring down at the water below. For a terrifying moment, Helen was sure her daughter would jump. She approached quietly, not wanting to startle her. "Emily? Honey?" Emily didn't turn. "I like the way the water sounds," she said softly. "It's peaceful. Everything's quiet here." Helen fought to keep her voice steady. "Let's go home, sweetheart, please." Emily slid off the railing, her shoulders slumped, and walked with her mother back to the car in silence. On the drive home, Helen squeezed Emily's hand. She didn't say anything, not then, but she made a silent promise. She would not lose another piece of her family. That night, Helen called a family meeting. She didn't bother with formalities, no dinner, no pretense of normalcy. She gathered everyone in the living room, voices overlapping in confusion and protest. "We need to talk," she said louder than she intended. The room fell silent. Helen looked at each of them, Tom, David, Julia, Emily, and saw in their faces not just exhaustion, but fear. "I know things are hard right now. I know we're all hurting. But I can't do this alone anymore. We have to face this together. No more secrets, no more pretending." Julia looked down at her lap. David rubbed his temples. Emily stared at her shoes. Tom, for once, had nothing to say. Helen continued, her voice trembling but strong. "David, you're scared. I get it. But you're not the only one. We're all terrified. But we can't keep shutting each other out. If we don't come together now, I don't know if we ever will." For a long time, no one spoke. Then, to Helen's surprise, Tom cleared his throat. "She's right. I haven't been much of a husband or father lately. I've been hiding. From you, from myself. I'm sorry." Julia spoke next, voice cracking. "I thought if I left, maybe the pain would go away, but it just made things worse. I don't want to run anymore." David finally looked up. "I screwed up. I might lose everything I've worked for. I'm scared you'll all hate me if that happens." Helen reached out, taking his hand. "Nothing you do could make us stop loving you, but you have to let us in." Emily sat quietly for a moment, then whispered, "I don't want to be invisible. I want things to be okay again." Tears streamed down Helen's face. She pulled Emily close, then the rest of the family joined. For the first time in a long time, they held each other, really held each other. It wasn't a solution, but it was a beginning. The days that followed were still hard. David's hearing loomed, and tension ebbed and flowed through the house. But something had shifted. The Andersons began talking about their fears, their hopes, even their anger. Julia kept her promise, coming home every night. Emily saw the school counselor regularly. Tom and Helen went on evening walks together, rediscovering the comfort of old habits. When the day of David's hearing arrived, the family dressed in their best clothes and drove together to the courthouse. Helen squeezed David's hand in the waiting room, whispering, "Whatever happens, we're with you." David faced the board with trembling hands but steady voice. He admitted his mistakes, took responsibility, and pleaded for another chance. The board listened in silence, then retired to deliberate. The wait was excruciating. When the board finally returned, the chairwoman spoke. "Mr. Anderson, your actions were serious, but your honesty and willingness to accept responsibility speak to your character. We have decided to place you on probation with mandatory ethics counseling." A wave of relief swept over David and his family. He hadn't lost everything, not yet. That night, the Andersons sat around the dinner table, exhausted but together. Helen looked at each of them, and for the first time in a long time, allowed herself to hope. Maybe this was what healing looked like. Not a sudden return to happiness, but a slow, stubborn refusal to give up on each other. Chapter 6. Unspoken Truths. The autumn rain swept over Millersville with a vengeance, drumming on the Andersons' roof, turning Willow Lane into a ribbon of gold and crimson leaves. The heat of summer had finally broken, but the Anderson house was still thick with tension, now less explosive, more like the heavy, expectant hush before the sky clears. After David's hearing, a fragile sense of hope began to take root. For the first time in months, the family moved in slow, careful harmony, as if afraid a single misstep might shatter what little peace they'd regained. Helen, ever the caretaker, eased herself into this new rhythm, cooking simple meals and drawing her loved ones into the kitchen for breakfast or tea, gentle rituals to bind their bruised hearts. Tom took to his work in the garden with renewed energy, raking leaves and fixing the fence, his hands red and rough, but his mind, finally, a little quieter. Julia, true to her word, came home every night. She started her college applications with Helen's help, staying up late at the kitchen table, drinking cocoa, their laughter a quiet defiance against the shadows of the past months. Emily still struggled. Her grades improved slightly and she made a few tentative steps back toward her old friends, but she was changed. Helen noticed how Emily clung to her at bedtime, or startled easily at loud noises, or avoided mirrors. The family kept a gentle eye on her, careful not to press, letting her move at her own pace. David, for his part, seemed lighter, though the strain of his probation and counseling still hovered over him. He set up a small office in the den, spending mornings working on legal research, evenings helping Emily with math homework or teasing Julia about her college essays. The Andersons, it seemed, were beginning to heal. But healing, as Helen was learning, was rarely linear. The past has a way of resurfacing, especially when least expected. One Saturday evening, after a long walk with Tom, Helen returned to the house to find the living room lit by a single lamp. Emily sat curled in an armchair, knees hugged to her chest, eyes red from crying. Helen knelt beside her. "Em, sweetheart, what's wrong?" Emily shook her head. "It's nothing." Helen waited, and after a while, Emily spoke. "Sometimes I think if I disappeared, nobody would notice. I feel empty, like a shadow." The pain in her daughter's voice cut Helen to the core. She took Emily's hands in hers. "You are not invisible. You are loved, more than you could ever know." Emily sniffled. "I know you love me, Mom, but sometimes it's not enough. Sometimes it feels like there's a hole in me, and I don't know how to fill it." Helen hugged her tight, rocking gently. "That hole isn't your fault, Em, and it doesn't mean you're broken. We all have scars, even if you can't see them, but we get through it together. We always do." For a long time they sat like that, the silence broken only by the rain. Elsewhere in the house, Julia finished a phone call with her friend. She'd been offered a part-time job at a local bookstore, and for the first time in ages, she was excited. She found Helen and Emily in the living room and sat on the floor at their feet telling them the news. David soon joined, and Tom came in from outside, tracking in the smell of wet leaves. The family gathered, sharing small stories, laughing a little. It was the most ordinary, precious kind of evening, the kind Helen hadn't dared hope for months ago. Later, after everyone had gone to bed, Helen sat with Tom on the back porch. The air was cool, the sounds of the night soothing. "I keep waiting for everything to fall apart again," Helen admitted. "Like we're just playing at being okay." Tom put his arm around her shoulders. "I know. But maybe that's what family is, falling apart and then putting each other back together, over and over." Helen smiled, tears brimming in her eyes. "I just wish it didn't hurt so much in between." He kissed her temple. "Me too." A few days later, David received a letter in the mail, a formal notice that he'd completed the first part of his probation with commendable honesty and progress. For the first time, David let himself believe that maybe, just maybe, things would work out. With her brother doing better, Julia focused on her future. She interviewed at the bookstore, got the job, and started bringing home stacks of books for Emily, who rediscovered a forgotten love of reading. Emily, with her family's gentle support, opened up little by little. She agreed to see a therapist at Helen's urging, and the darkness that had threatened to consume her began to recede. There were still hard days, but she no longer faced them alone. One Sunday, As the family walked together through the park, Emily reached for Helen's hand. "I'm glad we're all here," she whispered. Helen squeezed her hand, looking at her children, at Julia with her determined smile, at David's cautious optimism, at Emily's newfound spark, and felt gratitude overwhelm her fear. She knew there were more storms ahead. Life had taught her that nothing was permanent, neither joy nor sorrow. But for this moment, with her family together, she felt whole. And for Helen Anderson, that was enough. Chapter 7. Forged in the Fire. With the arrival of October, Millersville shed its autumn leaves in vibrant waves. The air turned crisp, and with each passing week, the Andersons' world seemed to slow, stretching the distance between the trauma of summer and the possibilities of an uncertain winter. The house on Willow Lane, once echoing with tension and secrets, now pulsed with a quieter, more determined energy, one born not of crisis, but of the daily work of putting a family back together. Helen was the first to notice the subtle but significant changes. She saw them in the small rituals the family had begun to share again. Morning coffee together in the kitchen, Julia and Emily bickering over music on the car ride to school, Tom whistling as he trimmed the hedges, David lingering in the living room after dinner rather than vanishing into the den. Even their arguments had changed. They were less barbed, more rooted in care than in old resentments. One Sunday, Helen decided to make pancakes for breakfast, a tradition she'd let slip during the worst of the summer. She set the table with mismatched mugs and plates, humming as she flipped the batter. Julia wandered in, rubbing her eyes, and Emily followed, her hair wild from sleep. Tom came in last, carrying a newspaper and a bouquet of sunflowers he'd bought at the farmer's market. "Sunflowers?" Helen teased, her eyes twinkling. Tom shrugged. "Seemed cheerful, and you deserve something cheerful." David joined them, still in sweatpants but smiling for the first time in days. The family gathered around the table. For a moment, there was only the scent of syrup and coffee, the sound of laughter, genuine, unforced. The wounds of the past months weren't gone, but Helen saw for the first time that they were healing. Later that week, Julia started her job at the bookstore. She came home with stories of quirky customers, favorite novels, and a newfound sense of independence. For the first time in months, she seemed genuinely excited for the future. She and Helen stayed up late planning campus visits, sketching out dreams that had seemed impossible just weeks before. Emily, buoyed by the stability in the house, began to thrive again at school. She submitted a short story to her English teacher, a story about a girl whose family nearly fell apart, only to find each other again, and it won first prize in a local contest. She allowed Helen to read it, and as Helen finished the last lines, she wept. Tears of pride and hope. David, too, began to emerge from his shell. The discipline of his probation gave him structure, and therapy helped him confront the shame and guilt that had weighed him down. He found the courage to reach out to an old friend he'd pushed away during the worst of his troubles, and together they began rebuilding their friendship. Tom helped him with odd jobs around the house, and their easy camaraderie returned, a partnership built not on unspoken expectation, but on mutual respect. The Andersons even began to talk about Richard, whose absence was still felt like a bruise. Tom received a letter from him, postmarked from a halfway house in Florida. Richard apologized for the pain he'd caused, thanked them for sheltering him when he had nowhere else to go, and promised he was finally getting the help he needed. For the first time, Tom allowed himself to hope for his brother's redemption. As Halloween approached, Helen suggested they host a small party for Emily and her friends. The family spent a weekend carving pumpkins, hanging orange and purple lights, and baking cookies in the shapes of ghosts and bats. On the night of the party, the Anderson house was filled with laughter, music, and the chatter of teenagers. For Helen, watching her family, her whole family, fill their home with light again felt like a victory. Yet beneath all this hope, Helen knew that recovery wasn't linear. Some nights were still hard. Sometimes the weight of the past pressed down on her, and she worried that all they'd built might shatter again. She lay awake, listening to the quiet breaths of her husband beside her, and wondered if she was strong enough to hold them together. One such night, she found herself on the back porch, arms wrapped around herself against the chill. David joined her, handing her a mug of tea. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked softly. Helen shook her head. "Just thinking." David nodded. "I do a lot of that these days, but it's getting better, Mom." I promise. Helen studied his face, searching for signs of strain. Instead, she saw the boy he'd once been, the bright, eager child, and the man he was becoming. She smiled, brushing his hair from his forehead. "I know it is," she said. "You all are. I'm proud of you." David looked away, embarrassed but pleased. Inside, Tom and Emily played a board game at the kitchen table, their laughter drifting out onto the porch. Julia sang along to a song on her phone, her voice sweet and strong. The house felt, for the first time in ages, like a home. As autumn faded toward winter, the Andersons found new strength in each other. The scars of the past remained, but they no longer defined them. They had been forged in the fire, changed perhaps, but not destroyed. And as Helen watched her family, her imperfect, resilient, ever-changing family, she realized that maybe the true heart of family was not perfection or ease, but the willingness to try again, to love through the darkness, and to keep building brick by brick, whatever storms may come. Chapter 8. Full Circle. The first snow arrived early in Millersville that year, blanketing Willow Lane in quiet white. The Anderson home, wrapped in pale morning light, felt softer than it had in months, as if the fresh snow had laid a gentle hush over all the old wounds and words left unsaid. It was, Helen thought as she looked out the kitchen window, a kind of grace, unasked for, but deeply needed. The holidays approached, bringing both anticipation and anxiety. For years, Thanksgiving and Christmas had been scripted routines, the same foods, the same stories, the same quarrels and laughter echoing through the rooms. This year, everything felt both fragile and new, like a family learning to walk again after a long illness. Helen worked quietly in the kitchen, her hands moving automatically as she kneaded bread dough and arranged cranberries for pie. She listened to the hum of the house, Tom fixing a loose banister, Emily giggling with a friend on the phone, Julia and David debating what movies to watch for their family marathon. Every ordinary sound felt extraordinary, a testament to survival. One afternoon, Tom came in from the cold, cheeks flushed. He set down his gloves and watched Helen for a long moment. "Do you ever wish we could go back?" he asked quietly. Helen didn't look up. "To when?" He shrugged. "To when things were easier, when the kids were small and the world didn't seem so complicated." Helen smiled, rolling out dough. "Sometimes, but I don't think we could have stayed there, even if we tried. Life finds a way to move us forward, whether we're ready or not." Tom nodded. "I guess I just miss who we used to be." Helen looked at him, seeing both the man she'd married and the one he'd become. "I miss them too, but I like us now, even with the scars." On Thanksgiving, the Anderson house filled with the smell of roasted turkey, cinnamon, and wood smoke. Julia brought her new boyfriend, nervously introducing him to Tom and Helen, while Emily played the gracious host, showing him her collection of snow globes and photographs. David offered a toast, awkward but heartfelt, thanking his family for standing by him through his darkest year. As they sat around the table, Helen marveled at the resilience that had grown from so much pain. She saw the way Julia leaned into her boyfriend, how David's laugh had returned, how Emily sparkled with the confidence she'd regained. She looked at Tom, their hands entwined on the tablecloth, and felt an ache of gratitude so sharp it brought tears to her eyes. When Christmas came, it was a quieter affair. No grand gestures or expensive gifts, just homemade cards, gingerbread, and walks through the snowy woods. Richard called on Christmas morning from Florida, his voice clear, stronger than it had been in years. He thanked the family for believing in him, and for the first time, promised he'd come visit in the spring. The Andersons gathered by the fireplace that evening, mugs of cocoa warming their hands. Tom read aloud from an old family journal, recounting tales of ancestors who'd crossed the country in covered wagons, built houses with their own hands, survived wars and heartbreak. Helen listened to the stories, feeling the threads that connected them, past to present, sorrow to hope. Later that night, Emily sat beside Helen on the window seat, watching snow fall in the orange glow of the street lamp. "Are we okay now?" Emily asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Helen thought for a long moment. "We're better than okay. We're together. That's what matters." Emily rested her head on her mother's shoulder. "I was so scared, Mom. I thought we'd never be whole again." Helen wrapped her arms around her daughter. "Me too, but you know what? Sometimes families break, but the good ones, the strong ones, find a way to come back together." Julia joined them, then David, and finally Tom. The Andersons watched the snow in silence, all four of them pressed together on the narrow seat, hearts beating in time. As the months turned and the days grew longer, the wounds of the past faded, not forgotten, but no longer raw. The Andersons celebrated small victories. Emily's art was accepted to a statewide show. Julia got into her top college choice. David completed his probation, receiving a letter of commendation from the board. Tom and Helen started volunteering at the local food pantry, giving back to the community that had supported them through their hardships. There were still difficult days. There were setbacks and arguments, fears that came rushing back on sleepless nights. But the difference now was the way they faced these storms, not as strangers sharing a roof, but as a family who had been tested, scarred, and somehow, miraculously, remade. On the first warm day of spring, the Andersons hosted a barbecue for their friends and neighbors. The yard was filled with laughter, children racing through the grass, the smell of charcoal and cut grass mingling in the air. Helen watched her family, flawed, resilient, beautifully imperfect, and realized that, for the first time in a very long time, she felt at peace. As evening fell, Helen stood at the end of Willow Lane, watching the sun slip behind the trees. She remembered the storms and the shadows, the nights spent wondering if they would ever make it through. And she knew now that, no matter what came next, they would weather it together. Life had come full circle. The Andersons had not been spared the fire, but they had emerged from it stronger, unbroken, and above all, united. Epilogue. The roots remain. Years passed and life continued to carry the Andersons forward, through triumphs and losses, through the quiet dailiness that comes after the storms. The family house on Willow Lane grew quieter as the children moved on. Julia left for college out of state. David built a career he could be proud of, and Emily blossomed into an artist whose paintings spoke of both sorrow and hope. Tom and Helen aged gently, the lines on their faces deepening not just from hardship, but from laughter shared across decades. Yet even as time worked its changes, the roots Helen and Tom had planted held strong. Holidays brought everyone back under one roof, sometimes crowded, sometimes bittersweet, but always threaded with love. They retold old stories, remembered those who were gone, and celebrated the simple miracle of still being together. One golden afternoon in late summer, Helen sat on the porch swing, watching Tom and the grandchildren chase fireflies across the yard. The air was full of laughter and the scent of honeysuckle. For a moment, she closed her eyes and listened to the symphony of voices, each one an echo of the journey they'd made. She thought of everything they had survived, the betrayals, the heartbreak, the nights filled with fear and uncertainty. She remembered how close they'd come to breaking and how, time after time, they had chosen each other instead. If there was a secret to happiness, Helen realized, it was not in having a perfect life, but in loving through the imperfections. It was in forgiving, in returning, in building a home not of walls, but of hearts willing to try again. As the sun dipped below the trees, Helen opened her eyes to the sight of her family, imperfect and whole. She knew there would be new storms one day, such is life, but the roots were deep, the ties strong, and that, she thought, was enough.